Okay, so the recording has started, right? So again, we're going to just recap on project estimation. And I'm going to stay on this slide, right? So it's just a cute little slide to tell you guys that, hey, we're dealing with project estimation. And first of all, we need to touch on our estimating terminology. So first of all, what is project estimation? Basically, it's doing analysis quantitatively on project-based variables. So basically putting a number figure to what situation is happening. So the difference between qualitative and quantitative analysis is that qualitative looks at data, we look at what's going on in the environment, and we make suggestions based on that. And we do it in such a way that um, it's usually language based. So you might find that in qualitative analysis, you usually find it being more wordy than you would a quantitative analysis, right? So what they're trying to find basically is the likelihood that the outcome of the project, the likelihood of the project being completed in relation to whatever variables we have in relation to cost, resources, the effort, and the time that needs to be put into it. And quantitatively, what we're doing is we're saying with qualitative, we would have said we are projected to complete the project. That's the result of a qualitative analysis. In a quantitative analysis, we're saying we are 75% likely to complete this project on time. So qualitative is saying what is happening. It's looking at the variables and making an assumption. And usually that assumption is, while it's based in logic, it's, hello, can you guys see the presentation, or are you seeing my notes? Are you seeing like the bullet points?
Yes, miss, we
Anyone?
can see the presentation.
Okay, great. Yeah, so in qualitative, you're looking to basically make an analysis on what is happening, but we do it and it's most likely going to be based in language, right? Whereas with quantitative analysis, we are basing it fully on math, like what is the likelihood of this? We don't want to know that it's likely. We want to know how much percentage likely is it that we complete this on time, right? So in estimation, we're dealing with the cost, we're dealing with estimating which resources we need, how much effort we need, where we need effort from, as well as how much time we need to spend on it. In our baselines, what we're doing is we're saying that this is where we're starting. This is what we want to do. This is our, this is our budget. This was the original stats that we wanted to be complete with. This is what our budget was originally. So that's our baseline. So your baseline, if you're somebody that's working a corporate job, your baseline for your budget is going to be, where your salary is and what are your basic expenses. So anything that changes from that is where you're doing further analysis now, right? Then we've got our actual cost, and your actual cost is looking to see how much realized cost has incurred for what you have done so far in relation a lot of times to where you're supposed to be right now. And then our planned value is trying to see how much more budget is left for the scheduled work that we have to complete, right? So your actual cost is with what costs have you actually incurred, how far have you actually gone on the project, and then your planned value is is how much more do you have left, right? Earned value now is when you put those two together and you're trying to basically authorize some sort of change. So if you need to measure how much work is performed in terms of where you were supposed to be, that is an earned value analysis, right? So the actual cost and the planned value, those are usually standard, and the earned value is where we try to find variances on that standard. And the variances specifically is just trying to see the differences between what was planned to occur and what actually occurred, right? So that's just a basic overview on it. Yeah, so what we're going to be doing later on in the course is really focusing in on that earned value. That's what we need to actually calculate today. So the next thing that, where are we? Give me one sec, let me come back. Right, so that's the basis of it. The presentation will be online, so you will have a chance to get it, or you can, screenshot what you see here. Let me just close my designer tab so it can be larger. Yeah. So our next slide is going through our different types of costs. So I did touch on this last week, but we're going to just go over it quickly. I'm doing that for everything, right? We're going over everything again. So when it comes to our different types of costs, our direct cost is basically, our direct cost is us trying to find out. All right, so our direct cost is us trying to see what costs can be directly attributed to a specific project. For instance, we probably bought equipment or materials for this one project. For instance, somebody came into our shop and they want some work done on their car, and you had to buy a specific color of paint for that car. That's going to be a direct cost to that car. Whereas the labor that you'd be paying the persons who are assisting you in fixing up that car is going to be spread across all of the cars that you did on that day. But the paint for that one car would be a direct cost to that one vehicle. Beyond that, we have indirect costs, which is the one where you've got to spread it out across everybody, all of the resources that were there at the time, or all of the resources that were used that are not directly attributed to one part of the process. The next type of cost is our fixed costs, and those costs remain constant regardless of what activities are going on, which period it's happening in a lot of times. So an example of that would be rent. Your rent is going to be the same cost every month, regardless of how many times you open and close the door, your rent remains the same. Variable costs, however, they change based on how they're used. So level of production, different types of activity, etc. So for instance, based on how many times you leave the AC on at night, that's going to change the cost of your power or energy for the building. So energy costs, water costs, those costs, they're variable. They change sometimes from month to month, a lot of times rather from month to month. But fixed costs, they stay the same regardless of how much you use or interact with whatever activity it is. Some costs, those are costs that have already been incurred and they cannot be recovered, right? You already spent it, you can't get that money back. If you let go of this process because you're not done with it, you close the project, it doesn't matter, you do not get that money back. So think of it like those deposits that you put down on things sometimes and they tell you that it's not refundable. Right. So if you don't actually go on that vacation, it doesn't matter. You lose a part of the cost that you used to book it. And the other type of cost is opportunity costs. Now, opportunity costs is the potential benefits that were forgone or given up because you chose another alternative, right? So maybe you find yourself in a position where you have two projects ahead of you and they will both give you some value, like you will get money back from both of them. The money that you give up because you chose one project over the other, the benefits you would have gotten from that one project is your opportunity cost, right? You gave up that project and that profit in order to pursue another one, most likely because you don't have enough resources to spread across both projects, right? But that's essentially what an opportunity cost is. You're giving up one for the benefit of actually getting something else. And now that I look at my thing, I don't see opportunity costs here, and it really should have been. Do I have it? I don't even see it there. So yeah. The next one that we have to look at is our estimated methodology. So when we're estimating, there are different ways that we estimate, right? So one of the models for estimation is our this word beats me up every time. Analog, but analogous. I think that's how you pronounce it, analogous. It's basically using the actual cost of previous or similar project as a basis for this project that you're going to do. So if you were making, like, let's say you had a process or a budget for making cherry juice, and you want to make cherry juice again, basically you're following the same process. Or even if you're not making cherry juice, but this time you want to make, well, not pineapple because it's a different process, but cherries, plums. Yeah, plums are similar to cherries. So, you know, the process that you go through to make cherry juice versus the process, oh, let's use passion fruit instead. And you want to use, you want to make passion fruit juice this time, you can use the process that you had for the cherry juice and the cost and the budget for that project. You can apply it to this new project because it's similar. You'll still need a blender, you'll still need sugar, water, and a cup, right? So that's basically how analogous estimating works. It's usually quick and cost efficient because most of the information is pre-provided. However, it's not always accurate, right? It's not a highly accurate. It doesn't always give you highly accurate results. You do have to do a lot of changing on it to make it work or to make it 100% accurate. But usually it's quick and easy. So something easy that you have to do that doesn't have a lot of risk involved. The other one is parametric. Hold on, give me one sec. Let me come back to my PowerPoint. Okay, yeah. The next one is parametric, and what that one does is that it uses some sort of statistical relationship between historical data to calculate the estimate. So in this case, think about it's similar to Anagilus, where you are looking for what happened before and you're building on that. But with parametric, you're looking at the historical data across a lot of times multiple periods. So instead of just looking at the last time you made cherry juice to make cherry juice this time, what you could do is you can look at the history of you making juices for a longer period. Or if you're gonna look, if we're doing budgeting, the last time we bought cherries, it was this cost, but we know, there's changes happening on our market regularly. So what you'll do is you look at the historical cost of cherries over a period of time to make an estimate on where you are most likely going to be. So you're looking at everything and you're trying to find an average, basically. You're trying to find the place that you fit in closest, and it tends to be more solid, more accurate than Anagilus estimation. The other one is your bottom-up estimating, right? So with bottom-up estimating, you look at the cost of everything at the bottom. So the smaller components of what you have to do, and then you add the components in as you go up towards the end. So if you're going to do bottom up for a juice example, again, we're looking at the cost from enjoying the juice. So the juice in the cup, you're looking at the cost of that cup and you're going upward, right? You're going back up to the blender, or you're going up to maybe the purchase, right? Because the purchasing would have been the first thing you had to do, and drinking it would have been the last thing. So we go from drinking it up to purchasing the cherries, right? We're going upward and we're adding our costs as we go up. So if you're building a car, you look at the cost of the car, the total cost of the car after it's made, and you go upward towards when you only had the chassis. Sort of. That's not a very good example. But what you're doing is you're trying to, one, introduce time into it, and you're trying to make it as accurate as you can. So you go to what your cost is going to be at the end, and you count going upward. You add your costing back up to the process. The other one that we use is our 3-point estimation. The 3-point estimating technique uses our optimistic cost, it uses our pessimistic cost, and our most likely cost in order to give us one average. So with parametric, I told you that we look at historical data, right? And we look at the trend for a while, and we see where we most likely will end up today. And I told you that that's a bit more accurate than just using the last occurrence of it. With 3-point estimating, you'd probably look at the lowest you've paid for cherries, the highest you've paid for cherries, and what the average cost is for cherries. You do all three calculations, and then you find the weighted average of all three, right? So in this case, it's not just historical, it's also taking into account, the fluctuating amount of those prices. We're looking at our three variables: the most optimistic, that is the best possible occurrence you can have; the most pessimistic, that's the worst possible outcome that you can have; and then the most likely, which one happens most frequently, or what's most likely. And then we put the three together and we weigh it by dividing it by usually 6, right? So it's all the formula. Do I have the formula in the presentation? No, I don't have the formula in the presentation, but I'm going to type it in. Give me a second. I have somebody coming in. All right, so with 3-point, I'll put the formula in there. That's usually what our formula looks like for our 3-point estimating. So in that case, what we're doing is we are trying to spread ourselves around to make sure that regardless of if our cost is the highest, it could possibly be the lowest or the most likely, that we are prepared to handle that cost. And then last one is expert judgment. That is, it could be one, bringing in an expert from the outside to estimate our costing for us. Maybe outsource. You can think of that as outsourcing the activity. Or you can bring that person onto your project and have them help you directly. So it can either be an outsource where you send the activity out and you pay somebody to do the entire thing, or you pay the person to come on your team and either consult with you for a short period or stay on that team with you to continue estimating. Right? So those are the three processes that the 5 methodologies that we usually use when it comes to estimating on projects. And the final thing we need to talk about is contingencies and escalations, right? So in this, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, so in 3-point estimating, we touched on this, where you look at what is most optimistic, most pessimistic, and most likely, right? With contingencies, we recognize that just like in estimating, costs move around, circumstances move around, activities sometimes have to move around. So what you usually have is some sort of reserve where you can give yourself space to possibly make mistakes, because we're working with people make mistakes, and mistakes should be okay and addressed in respectful manners, right? So with our contingencies, we have a contingency reserve, which is usually an amount of money or time that we have to cover any risk that might come up in the project that could possibly affect the project as a whole or the delivery of our product. We have a management reserve, which is usually an amount that we have there reserved for any unforeseen work that we might need to do that's within the scope of the project. So there are times where, sorry, there are times where you may be able to skip one step and go forward, or there are times where you might have to put in an extra step to get to somewhere, maybe because what you prepared ahead or the advice you were given maybe doesn't 100% fall in line with the current project that you have. So you have to make some changes there. And sometimes you don't exactly see those changes until you're on the activity, right? So with management reserve, you always kind of leave some space there for the scope to change. So when we are creating our scope at first, that's when we're in our planning phase, between planning and initiation phase. Initiation, we know what we need to achieve on a big level. We put those steps down closer, and we analyze them closer in the planning stage, and we plan for everything. And in planning, we usually leave some space there for your scope to change or for additional things to be added on or removed, right? So Of course, we talked about scope creep already, so you understand how scope moves. But our management reserve basically is there for us to be able to add in any additional resources or so that we might need for our team. And then when it comes to escalation, it really just refers to the anticipated increase of any sort of cost for resources over the life of the project. And it can be due to factors like inflation or market conditions. In addition, estimators, they usually should include an escalation factor in all of their estimates. So for instance, you understand that you have vendors that you go to very frequently, that you're most likely going to use every time you need to get something, but you also need to have a backup plan, right? So with escalation, what you're doing is you're trying to make sure that over the life of the project, over all of our resources, right, when it comes to the cost, especially, we try to make sure that we always have a reserve to cover anything that comes up, right? So contingency really deals a lot of time with money and time. Management deals with more changes in relation to the scope and how we deal with those. And escalation really deals with how we deal with things in relation to the reserves, right? How are we going to actually affect a change in scope, right? And how much does that change in scope affect the reserve that we had previously? And what else do we have left over? Do we still have scope, or do we still have time in relation to everything else that we need to do, right? So escalation is really the process of looking at all of our reserves and trying to see what more we can do, right? Contingencies are there in place of having to make a quick decision, but escalation is more something that the estimator would be managing. And if they find that we need to escalate it further, they take that usually to the project manager. And the project manager deals with whatever escalation needs to be done. If we need to bring somebody else on, if it's a major issue or so forth, right? Yeah. The last thing that we had to deal with for this would have been where is my PowerPoint? Yes. Next, we have types of contracts. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. We looked at it before, but just a quick overview. When we're dealing with types of contract, what we're looking at there is specifically how did we come up with those, well, not really how, but the baselines that we have, right? We have them signed by our entire team and our customer, so that the customer knows what they're getting and what they have to give in return, right? So when we solidify that, we put it on a contract. So contracts can take different forms. I put them all here so you can read through. But when we're talking about fixed contracts, we mean that there's one set price. We understand that there will be risks that, costs can overrun at specific times. And usually the cost at that time would be borne by whoever is the person that gave that contract. So if I give an estimate to my customer or my client, and I need to make a change to that, we had a fixed agreement. So that change is on me to deal with, right? It's not on that person. Whatever additional cost it is, I will have to bear the cost of that, or I'm really going to have to go and ask them to change that. But it's not something that we encourage when it comes to fixed contracts. Fixed contracts really should stay price fixed. When we're talking about cost reimbursable ones, in that case, we have a contractor that's paid for, legitimate costs that came up or were incurred across the life of our project. And we add any additional fees that we have for our profits. So we know exactly what it was for costs, and we keep our fee fixed. So the example I'm coming up with right now is like a seamstress or a tailor. So going to school, like we all went to school, well, most of us would have went to school and gone to school in Guyana, and we all had to either buy uniforms from Guyana stores or somewhere else, or we had to have a seamstress on hand to sew for us. So I had a seamstress, and what we would do is we'd either buy material or we'd buy the uniform from, where was it? It's not Keyshaws. It's Guyana stores. We'd buy the uniform there, and then we take it to the seamstress. So sometimes if we bought just bare cloth, the price would be one thing. If we bought the uniform pre-sewn, it would be something else, right? So the cost of buying the material would be borne by the client. So in that case, myself as the student, right? My seamstress, however, she had one fixed cost. So every time I went to her, I knew what the cost was for her to either one cost to alter a pre-made uniform or one cost to sew an entire uniform. So you know the cost of the person's service, right? And that's additional to the cost of the material. So the cost of the materials can fluctuate, but the cost of the service does not usually fluctuate and it's usually set ahead. The other type of contract that we have is a time and materials contract. And in those, the contractor is usually paid based on the amount of time and material that is used. So both your time and material, they're really flexible, and it can change from time to time. So think of it like you take your car in for servicing, you would have one projected, they'd give you like a projected fee for what it's going to cost for them to bring in materials. Maybe you got to change some bushels or something on the car. When they go into the car, they need to make additional changes. So they change that, but they have to also use additional time. So they tell you, hey, you got to come another day instead. Maybe they say you have to pay additional costs for labor. We're not sure. It also happens a lot in like the building of homes, right? Contractor costs, they can change often. So they need to be monitored a lot more by the client in that case, right? But those are the general types of contracts that we have in project management. And the last thing that we need to go through for right now is our problems in estimation, right? When it comes to estimation, as we've gone through, there are lots of variables that can change from day to day, right? On top of that, we could agree one thing and then the economy changes in a different way. We understand, inflation is happening. We understand what risk is. So those things actually, they can a lot of times present lots of challenges for the project manager. And the project manager needs to know whenever there are major problems coming up. So if you are the estimator and you see a problem coming up, let the project manager know, especially if you think it's something that can impact the completion of the project or the quality of that product that we're giving out. So common problems that you find, one is in uncertainty and risk. So incomplete information and sometimes unforeseen risks, they can lead to inaccurate estimates. So we did talk about the fact that in some estimating methodologies, they're more accurate than others. But no estimates aren't usually always 100% correct, right? So there's always some level of risk in any project that you undertake. And those things can sometimes affect the estimating process as a whole. The other thing that affects us very frequently is scope changes. So, maybe you're making a website for somebody and they ask for 3 basic tabs, and then they ask you for an additional tab, and then they want some additional interface on there. Maybe they come and they say they want you to, instead of just having it be like a blog, they want it to be like a personal website, or they make changes. So sometimes you might say, yes, it's something that can be done, but it changes the scope of your work significantly, right? So scope changes will happen in projects, and in order to not make it a problem, you should be communicating those honestly with your client at all times, right? So that's a conversation usually between the project manager and the client, to manage how that scope looks and to keep the scope as stable as possible. But you always have to account for, deviations to the plan, because things happen, right? The next one is lack of historical data. So if I'm running a project and it hasn't been run before, there most likely will not be any historical data that I can use, right? Sure, I might be able to find projects that were similar, and, do something close to that, but it's not always going to be accurate. Well, if you don't have historical data, a lot of times your projects are not going to be accurate unless you have like a project subject matter expert on hand that can lead you through that. But if you don't have access to an expert, you also don't have access to data. Maybe it wasn't collected before. You kind of have to go in and figure your way out, right? The other problem that you can find in estimating is bias, right? So we all have biases. That's a human fact, right? We all have things that we like and things that we don't like. Now, when it comes to our estimation, in the 3-point estimation, we spoke about the optimistic outcome, the most likely outcome, and the pessimistic outcome. When we're dealing with bias, we have to think about your personal optimism on what your scope or your cost looks like. You also have to think about what your pessimistic biases are. So it could be a case where I personally feel this or I personally feel that, but I haven't actually gone out there to double check my feelings. Right? As a project manager, I shouldn't be working on my feelings or what I think. I should be double checking it with what is factually available. Now, of course, that's an issue if you don't have historical data. So if there's no historical data, there probably is going to be more bias introduced into your project. However, you should find ways to balance it out. So maybe get somebody else on the project. Maybe if you don't have a subject matter expert, you also get somebody else that's on your team to just double check what you're doing. Maybe the project champion or project sponsor can be somebody that's useful here in eliminating bias. But whenever you have to make a decision in relation to your project, you should seek to remove as much bias as you can. But there will be times where bias seeps in there. The other one that we think about is complexity. So some projects, so as you are all doing your different projects, some are more complex than others. I've seen some PERT charts where you have 10 activities. I've seen some PERT charts where you have like 20 activities. So one project is obviously more complex than the other, right? So complexity is something that has to be managed from project to project, but it really depends on which activities inside are deeply related to the other. So we call that interdependence when, every step of the project is very, very crucial to be accurate because the output of activity A has to go into activity B, and then that messes up with the quality of activity B if activity A wasn't done correctly. So if every step of your project leads directly from one to the next, to the next, to the next, you have to be very, very careful to make sure that every single step of that is correct. So usually the shorter your network, the more complex your project is going to be. If you have more space, you a lot of times have more flexibility to maybe make a mistake or so forth. But if you're running on a really tight deadline, it's going to be more complex. You're going to have more stress on that project. If you're running on a very, very, very tight budget, like you are already above budget, it adds a different level of complexity now to completing. So complexity changes as you go through the project. And a lot of times it's closely related to the risk. Like you usually do your risk analysis ahead to know where you stand. The other problem in estimating is stakeholder pressure. So we know who stakeholders are, right? So stakeholders are anybody related to the project that has an interest in it. So that could be your project sponsor. It could be your client. It could be somebody else in the organization, like another functional manager. Could be anybody related to this project, right? Clients usually want everything all the time at the lowest possible cost. That's okay. As a project manager, you have to be able to manage their expectations and to make them as realistic as possible. We talked about scope changes. We spoke about scope creep. Manage those things very, very tightly, right? Your stakeholders, they will always want the best. Your project sponsor, they will want you to finish, probably want you to finish a preview of the project to maybe show it to the management team so that they can show what their teams are working on, right? if you're not done, you have to find a way to say that, or you have to find a way to motivate your team in order to get it done by the deadline. But as a project manager, you have to manage stakeholder pressure, and there will always be stakeholder pressure. They will always want the best. And not to say that they want to give you the least, but them wanting the best sometimes really messes with your timeline. It messes with your estimates. It messes with the stress level of your team to be changing things over and over and over. So you definitely have to manage stakeholder pressure when dealing with projects, right? Whether it's a client or your project sponsor, or sometimes even the people on the team, right? So that is estimating in a nutshell.